amazing panels. Hope you guys have a great day today. Allow me to introduce myself. I am NURUL HIDAYATUL AKMA BINTI Ali, and along with my partner, so we're going to present our research project, namely emergency fund provisions among young student adults in Malaysia.
Research background. Malaysia on the whole lacked adequate emergency saving in the event of long-term unforeseen disaster. According to the Central Bank research, more than 75% of Malaysians find it difficult to raise even 1,000 in cash for emergency. Moreover, financial management is a complex collection of the action and decision that can change depending on the relevance and difficulty of the behavior as well as people's ability, skill and opportunity to do so. Moreover, inadequate financial behavior, for example, can lead to temporary or chronic debt, inability to pay utility bills, bankruptcy, and such behavior are the result of broad economic and psychological causes. So, basically, an emergency fund is a money that set aside for unplanned expenses such as medical bills, home repair, or loss in income. Using the emergency saving to cover unexpected expenses is better than paying them with high-interest credit card or taking out a loan. Individuals should build up an emergency fund 3 to 6 months worth of spending according to the financial planning. On the other hand, between 2015 and 2019, 84,805 Malaysians were declared bankrupt. According to the Insolvency Department, bankruptcy cases involving people under the age of 34 accounted for 26% of the all cases. Yet in 2018, Assistant Governor Nazrul MOHAMAD of Bank Negara Malaysia said that 47% of Malaysian youth have excessive credit card debt. As a result, this research was conducted to emphasize on how important it is to have an adequate emergency fund among the young adult for the preparation in the future. Next, problem statement. Newly independent youth or young adult are one of the most essential groups when it comes to the financial information and education, since they are the beginner in the creating financial identities and obtain the possibility to have the proper way in saving habits. Zooming into the Malaysian context, Malaysian young adults are facing difficulty to settle their financial liabilities due to the absence of saving behavior based on Zing 2019. According to Alex, nowadays Malaysian young adults tend to save less. Statistics show that only 73% of Malaysian young adults save any money. Furthermore, the issue of bankruptcy also is one of the contributors to the lack of emergency fund provision among young adults, and being declared bankrupt before reaching the age of 30 is not uncommon this day based on AKPK 2014. One of the variables that contribute to this condition is the pressure of living a luxurious lifestyle. Plus, the Malaysian Credit Counselling and Debt Management Agency (AKPK) noted that what is worrying is that the ages of those declared bankrupt now also include those who are younger. There is now an increase in bankruptcy in our country, with over 47% of young adults aged between 18 until 35 years old are having serious debt due to living beyond their means. Based on the above presented fact, it shows that most of the young adults in Malaysia do not have adequate emergency fund provision. What's actually persuade the young adult to prepare the emergency fund? Are they aware enough on how important having an emergency fund is, especially during the critical time? This is a serious matter that requires a strict attention, and any result or outcome from this study will further assist the Malaysian, especially the young adult, and somehow could overcome this matter.
Next, as shown on the screen right now, it is the research questions of our group. There are 3 research questions that used in this study. Firstly, does attitude have a significant relationship towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults? The second question is, does norms have a significant relationship towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults? And lastly, does perceived behavioral control have a significant relationship towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults. As for the research objective, there are three objectives that used in this study, which are, firstly, to identify the influence of attitudes towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young adults. Second, to identify the influence of norms towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young adults. Thirdly, to identify the influence of behavioral control towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young adults. Next, this is the conceptual framework of this research. There are independent and dependent variables that have been used. For independent, it consists of three different variables, which are attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control. Meanwhile, behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia is the dependent variables for this study. Attitude can be referred as the evaluation outcome of executing a behavior. It can come in terms of positive and negative attitude depending on the evaluation of the outcome. The hypothesis of this variable is, for Hassan, there is no significant relationship between attitude towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults, while for Hassan, there is significant relationship between attitude towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults. According to Hassan 2011, he defined subjective norm as the perceived social pressure to perform the behavior. In other words, it can be referred as the actions taken by a person due to the pressure around them. This research explored did the norms such as family, partner, culture, religion, or even friends influence the intention of having emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia. The hypothesis of this variable is, for Hassan, there is no significant relationship between subjective norms and behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia. As for H2, there is significant relationship between subjective norms and behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia. Next, perceived behavioral control refers to people's perception of the ease or difficulty of performing the behavior of interest. Hassan 1991. Hypothesis for this variable is, for Hassan, there is no significant relationship between perceived behavioral control and behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia. As for H3, there is significant relationship between perceived behavioral control and behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia. Moving on to this research methodology, this study used quantitative method as the research design. As for the unit of analysis, it is the individual student at UiTM Shah Alam Selangor. Meanwhile, for the sample of this study was 384 respondents. For sampling technique, we used the convenience sampling and Likert scale for the data measurement. This research used online survey questionnaire to collect the data of the respondents. We also used descriptive, Pearson correlation, and multiple regression for the data analysis. Next, it is the finding of the demographic profile. This study was associated with 384 respondents, and there were 35.4% male respondents and 64.6% of female respondents. Besides that, 62% of the respondents whom 22 years old and above, and the other 38% respondents were 21 years old and above. Majority of the respondents is single, and the 21.9% respondents were married. Furthermore, this study participated by full-time students with 69.5%, along with the education level. Mostly respondents are students with bachelor's degree with 38.8%. Finally, 63% majority of the respondents stay with their family, and they were dependent in terms of financial dependency. Next, we move on to the hypothesis testing. This study used fixed p-value which equals to 0.05. For hypothesis 1, to identify whether attitude influences the behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults. The results found that R equals to 0.662 and the p-value was 0.000. Decisions for this hypothesis is H1 is accepted and H0 is rejected. As for the second hypothesis, it is to identify whether subjective norms influence the behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults. The results found that R equals to 0.270 and the p-value was 0.000. Thus, H alternate is accepted and H0 is rejected. As for the third hypothesis, it was to identify whether perceived behavioral control influenced the behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults. The results found that R equals to 0.282 and the p-value was 0.000. Decisions was accepted the H alternate and rejected H0. Finally, this study proposed the most influence factor towards behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults through the multiple regression analysis. Based on the beta value, attitudes have the most influential factors of the behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia.
Research recommendation. The first recommendation is educate the society. Based on the findings, it shows that attitude has a significant relationship to the behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young adults. It can be explained that education can be associated with attitude because educated people will show positive action. Therefore, education plays an important role in society, and every individual is responsible in getting education to ensure the knowledge about the importance of saving emergency fund can be enhanced for the future. Furthermore, there are suitable recommendations that are available that can be done through educating the society through many alternatives, such as promoting the info regarding the emergency fund provision among young student adults through doing the campaign or seminar that related to the matters. For example, the institution of higher education can conduct a campaign at the university and encourage the youth to take part. This relationship shows that education can be an influential factor towards the attitude of a person. With proper knowledge, it will lead for an individual to gain intention to have an emergency fund provision. It also can remove the bad stigma of the society towards these students when students have their own saving, and it will make the student more independent and debt-free in future. Next recommendation is increase the motivation of young student adults. Motivation is defined as the process of inspiring people to reach high level of performance and overcome obstacles in order to change. Moreover, motivation also can be influenced by this attitude, subjective norm and behavior of individual. This means that the motivation depends on the daily life of the individual. If she or he lives in healthy condition, it will implement a good spirit and motivation to achieve success in future rather than in study or other action. Meanwhile, when someone is surrounded with a negative situation, it will cause her or him to lower their motivation level since there is no factor that encourages them. Here, we can see that there is a strong relationship regarding the motivation and subjective norm. Subjective norms are defined by an individual motivation to conform with other view and their perception of social pressure from others to behave in specific way. As a result, subjective norm will be influential factor that implement individual motivation, and it's also be the main key in student to have emergency fund provision. The higher the motivation level in the student will cause her or him to have an intention and be more disciplined in implementing their own emergency fund provision. Limitation of the study and future recommendation. For the limitation facing during conducting the research is limited number of participants in research. Young adult, which can be classified into three broad categories, which are the adolescent years, generally defined as puberty through age 18, adulthood, generally defined as 18 to 20 or 18 to 25, and later adulthood, generally defined mid-20s and older. So here refer to young adult among the range of age, and it also can be either student or not, since Study is a choice whether the individual wants to pursue his study or not. Furthermore, it also limits the research since the research only focuses on young student adult in Malaysia, since there also a huge number of young adult not pursuing their study and choosing to work. As for the suggestion on this limitation, the researcher may discover and provide the research to the public, since young adult is not only related to the student, however, it's also related to the young adult as a whole, and it is hoped that for the future researcher need to widen the participant in collecting the data. For the last limitation is sampling bias. Sampling bias is defined as the circumstances in which the sample statistics used by the researcher do not accurately reflect the true value of the parameters the target population. As a result, sample bias occurred in the study because the researcher did not include the race and religion section in the questionnaire. As a suggestion to overcome the sampling bias for the future study, the researcher may include the race and religion section in the questionnaire. Based on that, the researcher gets the information regarding the respondent background and target population.
In a nutshell, it can be concluded that attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control be the influence factors towards the behavioral intention of involvement in emergency fund among young student adults in Malaysia. That's all from us. A big thank to our supervisor, Madam Nora, for all her guidance given to us. And lastly, to the panels, we appreciate all the comments and response. Thank you.